Now, Sukkot is also one of the 3 pilgrim feasts of Israel. You have Pesach, or Passover, which is at the beginning of the grain harvest in the springtime. Then you've got Pentecost, Shavuot, at the end of the grain harvest, 50 days later. And here, Tabernacles, or Sukkot, celebrating the autumn harvest of fruits such as grapes and figs. These were the feasts where all the Jewish males of Israel were commanded to go to Jerusalem to worship the Lord, and Sukkot was a week-long celebration. You can read about it in Leviticus 23, Numbers 29, Deuteronomy 16. I'll repeat that: Leviticus 23, Numbers 29, and Deuteronomy 16 tell us about Sukkot. And they were commanded to live in booths, or Sukkot in Hebrew, to remind them year after year of the miraculous provisions that God gave the people of Israel when they lived in the wilderness for 40 years. These booths were to remind them that they weren't wandering aimlessly in that wilderness. God Himself led them. And even while they lived in temporary shelters, while they awaited their permanent homeland, waited to come into the land of Israel, God took care of them in that wilderness. And so these booths served as a visual reminder from year to year to year, even today, of what God did for the people of Israel. So you might say, and the whole nation of Israel during the Feast of Booths is like a camping experience, because you'll see all these booths or sukkot throughout the land. You would build a sukkah and make sure that even though the roof was covered with palm fronds and branches, you could still see the stars through those at night. And I'm sure you would wonder about what your ancestors must have gone through on their way through the wilderness to the promised land. What this is an apartment building there in Jerusalem, and you can see an upper sukkah and a lower sukkah. So the houses are built, on an incline, and so you can see 2 of them there. And can you see the roofs, the way that they are partitioned, so they're not covered totally in full? Again, there's that space that you can look out and see the stars at night. So it's an amazing experience to be in the land and walk through and see these everywhere on every house. These booths, once again, served as a reminder and a testimony to the faithfulness of God. You could say that these Sukkot, these booths, were a reminder to the whole country that God has always provided for their needs. He's always provided for them, and He has promised to always take care of Israel. And not only does Sukkot look back at the past of what God did, but it also looks forward prophetically to the heavenly messianic feast in the world to come. That great marriage supper of the Lamb, as we Christians call it, when we will spend eternity in God's very presence. This life on earth is only temporary as we await our eternal dwelling. And that is a great theme of Sukkot. So even the name tabernacles is interesting here in John's gospel, because remember, the book opens up by saying that Jesus Himself came and dwelt. Well, it's the same term for tabernacled among us there in John chapter 1. So we'll see some very important connections to the Feast of Tabernacles with Jesus' identity later on in these chapters. We'll talk more about its ceremonies and traditions, which are very, very rich, next week when we get to them in the text. But that's the backdrop of Sukkot, remembering what God did there in the wilderness and looking forward to our eternal home. Verses 3 through 5 tells us about the brothers of Jesus. These are His half-brothers, the sons of Mary and Joseph. We know their names from the Synoptic Gospels, and they tell us that Jesus had at least 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And we know that James and Judas, or Jude, actually later on went to write New Testament letters. But at this point in time, none of his brothers see Jesus for who He really is. But they tell him to go to the region of Judea, where Jerusalem is located. And of course, Jerusalem is the spiritual headquarters, the capital of Israel. And they imply that if Jesus is really who he says he is, then why wouldn't he show his power to everyone? Why wouldn't he expand to a wider audience? So Jesus' brothers think that if you're wanting to spread your message, why would you do it in secret? Notice they say if. There's that hint of unbelief there on their part. We'll see this thinking later on in John 7, when the leaders will think that Jesus may go to teach among the Greeks, where there would have been a much wider audience, and potentially he might have escaped persecution. Potentially. It didn't really make human sense for Jesus to stay only in the very, very tiny area of Israel, but that was God's plan. That was God's plan. Jesus is saying to his brothers, it's my time versus your time. My time versus your time. It's as if Jesus and his brothers had very different ideas. Well, we could even say they were of different worlds, as one author noted. We've talked so many times in the past that Jesus did not quite fit the majority expectation of what the Messiah should be. And that caused a lot of confusion for people. So he says, my time has not yet come. We've already seen that there's been this repeated theme of Jesus' hour throughout John. And this is related to that, though there's a different Greek word for time, an hour. But there's this drumbeat, as it were, marching to that appointed hour when Jesus will finally say in John 17, Father, the hour has come, glorify your Son. But that time is not quite yet. His brothers don't understand it all. And you know, that can still happen today. We sometimes have our ideas of what God should do, what appears to be the best route, and we can limit his movement in our lives by trying to fit him in our little box. Sometimes God's will doesn't make sense to those that are on the outside. But if we're true to God's will, that we discover daily, by seeking him in prayer and in the word every day, we can know his perfect plan will be accomplished in his own timing. And if we'll leave things to him, there's a lot of pressure that get removed from our shoulders when we leave everything in his care, isn't there? In verse 7, Jesus declares that the world hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. Jesus shines light on evil deeds, and so the world hates him. One either accepts Jesus' message or rejects it. There's no middle ground. And most people don't want someone to shine the light on their sin. It's like this even in the world today. And not everyone wants to be confronted with the truth. We see here that he goes up, but he's going in his own timing. He never gives in to pressure. Despite his initial response, where it seems like maybe he's not going to do it, he ends up doing what's been requested anyway, but it's on his own terms. He didn't say he wasn't going to the feast at all, just not with everyone else as he would have been expected to. In those days, you traveled in large groups from wherever you were down to Jerusalem for many reasons. For safety, it was like a big family reunion several times a year, much like a caravan. He chose to go privately, it would appear, and not with great crowds, not publicly, but in private, as opposed to showing himself off to the world, as his brothers had indicated. Verse 11 tells us the people were asking a question. Where is Jesus? We see this is one of the major issues and themes in John. Where is Jesus? Where's Jesus? And who is he? Who is Jesus? Verse 12 tells us that there was muttering or grumbling, murmuring among the people about Jesus. And in keeping with our Exodus theme, we remember that in Exodus chapter 17 and in Numbers 11, the same language is used. The people were murmuring, remember? They're in the wilderness. They were murmuring. And so we see that same terminology here, of course, with our Exodus background. So there was division over who exactly Jesus was, or who they thought he was, and they were divided among their opinions. Verse 13 will tell us that no one spoke openly because they were afraid of the Jews, meaning the Jewish leaders who were opposed to him. That word for openly in Greek is the same word the brothers used when they said, no man works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. And then we'll see it again in verse 26 later on when Jesus is speaking openly there in Jerusalem. And so here we see that people are afraid to speak openly about Jesus out of fear, So Dan, why don't you continue as we get to the middle of the feast?
Yeah, so in verse number 14, go ahead and come back to your Bibles if you would, and let's read the next number of verses. As I shared with you at the opening, we divide this chapter up into three major sections. So the first 13 verses have been during the beginning of the feast. Now, at the midway point, during the middle of the feast, represented from verse 14 through 36, this is the middle of the feast. Jesus is going to come up to Jerusalem. Verse number 14, it says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and taught. So you can see this is the area of the Temple Mount, if you'll look up here. I took this from on top of Mount Scopus, up Hebrew University, where we studied at, and it's looking back down over a good portion of Jerusalem. You can see the large gold dome there, which most of you are probably familiar with. But in that area is where the Jewish temple once stood. Okay, it stood in an area of about 32 acres. So this was a huge area. So this is where Jesus is coming to. And he's going to spend the next several days doing some pretty incredible teaching in the temple area. Okay, so back to our text. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and taught. The Jews marveled or were puzzled or were amazed, maybe your translation reads, at it, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? So Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but it is his who sent me. If any man's will is to do the will, or to do his will, he shall know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Remember, the source of Jesus' authority has been a big topic of discussion throughout the Gospel of John and through the Gospels as well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, verse number 18, it says, he who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. We're going to put the pause button on right there. Let's come back and let's talk about these verses 14 through verse number 18 for just a few moments. So here Jesus is. It's the middle of the feast. He's come to Jerusalem, and this is the first time we see Jesus teaching in the temple in the Gospel of John. Now we see this in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus is going back and forth at times and teaching in the temple. And of course, the last week of his ministry, he's going to speak basically every day and teach in the temple. But this is the first time we see this in John. Okay? So again, we've got a three-part dialogue that takes place over the next several verses. The question that we want to deal with tonight, the question that we read about, the question that everybody was asking is, well, what are the origins of Jesus' teachings, and where does he get his authority from? Okay? They had real questions about Jesus' religious training. Remember, we even read it here. And in verse number 15, they say, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? Now, let's go ahead and let's just clear something up. It's not that Jesus had never studied. All Jewish young men were thoroughly trained in the biblical text. Within every synagogue, which is, again, much like a church today, it's what the church was patterned after, if you didn't know that. Where do we get a lot of why do we do a lot of the things we do, and where do we get the basis for a lot of that? We get it straight out of the ancient Jewish synagogue. But a part of every Jewish synagogue in the first century when Jesus was living on this earth, they had something called the Bet Midrash. The Bet Midrash. Okay? And it was the house of learning or the house of study. All Nations Biblical Study Center is based loosely on that model. What happens at All Nations? We give people an opportunity from this church and other congregations to come together through the week and really study the Word of God together. And that's the way every Jewish young man learned. Every Jewish young man, with rare exception, was thoroughly trained in the Bible. I mean, it's really astounding the great education that young Jewish men had right there in their local synagogue. So it's not that Jesus didn't have any learning. The question here, and what's caused them to be amazed, is that Jesus had never studied in one of their academies that were in Jerusalem, per se. Now, if you wanted to be a great teacher, you had to go through proper channels. So Jesus didn't come up through the normal channels where you would be thoroughly trained in the Bet Midrash, and then if you wanted to become a rabbi or a great teacher, you would go and seek out a great teacher in one of the great universities there in Jerusalem. And you would come underneath that rabbi and you would be taught by him for a number of years. And then when you graduated or you were ordained, you'd be given the right to go out and teach in the various synagogues. But when you taught, you'd never teach in your own name. You would always teach in the name or the authority of great teachers who had come before you. Now, this is what's causing the amazement here, because remember, as we've seen in the other Gospels, especially the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 through 7, we call it the Sermon on the Mount. What do we hear Jesus saying all the time? You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. You've heard that it was said by Moses. You've heard that it was said by so-and-so, but I say to you. Nobody taught like that in Jesus' day. But Jesus is doing it. Why can he do that? Well, we believe he's the Messiah. And Jesus is going to show the people that his true source of authority is not a man. Hello. Where does Jesus draw his authority from? In his right to teach? The Father. Remember back to John chapter 5? If you'll go and read John 5, Jesus has had this discussion in Jerusalem before. And he said, listen, everything that I do, everything that I say is just what my heavenly Father has told me to say. So when Jesus talks, it's the Father talking. When Jesus teaches, it's not his own teaching. It's the teaching of the Father who sent him. So again, these folks are just having a hard time getting their head around what is this guy doing, coming in here teaching the way that he does. Because no one in Jesus' day believed that you had what's called inherent authority. Meaning you're not going to find people out teaching saying, well, this is my opinion on it. How many times have you heard somebody do that, even today? Well, Daniel, this is how I interpret it. And sometimes it can be the wrong interpretation. Hello? Everybody can't be right. We understand that, don't we? Hello? Can everybody be right? You're there, I know it. No. And so no one would have ever come along and said, I just think this, and I don't care what so-and-so has to say about it. This is what I have to say about it. It was very, very taboo. We lose some of this in our culture today. I mean, we do. It's hard for us to really get our head around what a serious issue this was. Jewish people believed that there was only one who would be able to teach in their own authority. The official messenger of God, known as the Shaliach. The Shaliach. And Jesus says here, we read the text, that he has been sent by God. Jesus makes it very clear that the reason he's able to teach the way that he does is because he is, in fact, that long-awaited Shaliach. He is that divine messenger who was to come and clear up a lot of different ideas about what the will of God was. Remember back in Matthew 5 through 7? Some of you were with us when we did that teaching. There was a lot of different ideas about what the will of God was. And sometimes great men were divided over what the will of God was. And so what they said was, well, when the Messiah comes, he'll really straighten us out on this issue. That's why when Jesus comes, he can say, you've heard that it was said, but here's the definitive word on what God's will is. Folks, we are so blessed to have our Gospels, aren't we? So much of the guesswork about the will of God, it's just taken out when we read the Gospels. Folks, I want to encourage you. I want to plead with you. Read, study these wonderful things we call the Gospels. Folks, it's easy to come up with a lot of wrong ideas about what the will of God is, isn't it? Have you ever had to change your idea about what you thought was the will of God? This book will help clear a lot up, won't it? Jesus hits the most major issues that any of us are going to deal with in our life. The answers are right here on this page. And over we find Jesus doing what he's doing here, giving a definitive word about what God's will is for their life. Now notice what happens here. They're amazed. Maybe your text reads they were puzzled in verse number 15. It's to be almost beside yourself. This is how shocking it was. Another thing that really shocked them was not only the way that Jesus was teaching, but they realized the great depth of understanding that he had. And notice what they say in verse 15. How could he have this kind of learning without having studied? We've already talked about the fact that Jesus did, in fact, study, okay? He was well learned. He just didn't come up through the proper channels, as it were. Now, you may recall a similar account where we find the same wording that we have here. Go and read this whole passage later, but it's Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4, long about verse number 13. There's a couple of guys by the name of Peter and John. Ever heard of them? Pretty important individuals, would you agree? They were part of Jesus' inner circle, we would say. There was Peter, James, and John. Well, we've got Peter and we've got John. They're there in the temple. They're teaching with great authority, not in their own name, but in the name of Jesus. And you remember what happens? The Sanhedrin, the religious leaders, are very upset about this. They pull them before that high council, that supreme court, as it were. And you remember what they said to them? We order you not to teach anymore in this name, in the name of Jesus. Fine if you want to heal people, fine if you want to do your stuff, but quit teaching in the name of Jesus. But if you'll read there in Acts chapter 4, it says, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, knowing that they were uneducated men, it's the same word that's used of Jesus here, unlettered, unschooled. When they realized that these men were unlearned, didn't come up through those channels, Acts chapter 4 says they took note that these men had been with who? Had been with Jesus. Got anybody in here spent some time with Jesus? Yeah. If we'll spend time in this book, he'll teach us. Doesn't matter what your educational background is. We can all learn. Hello? Last time I checked, the thing that I love about Jesus is he was willing to teach anybody. He believed in everybody. He wasn't just up in Jerusalem just teaching those that were already highly educated and had the stamp of promise all over him. Jesus poured his heart and his soul into people who maybe didn't have all the opportunities, but he knew their life could make a difference. He knew they had potential. All they needed to have was hunger. Got anybody hungry in here tonight? Hello? Jesus himself said, blessed are you when you hunger and thirst for righteousness, for you will be completely satisfied. Folks, I wish I could tell you that everybody I've met, and as long as I've been serving the Lord, is hungry for God. I'm talking about church people. Not everybody's hungry, folks. They're just not. And this disturbs us, doesn't it? Because we are hungry. We love the Word of God. We want to understand more of His nature, more of His ways. But folks, not everybody is hungry. But the beautiful thing that we have in this text is that if we will spend time with Jesus, He will equip us to go out and represent Him. I want to remind you, Peter and John, they were fishermen. They were regular folk, just like you and I. But the power of God transformed them in such an incredible way as they spent time with Jesus, and literally they changed their world. We find them doing amazing things throughout the book of Acts. So again, these are the real issues that we've got going on here in John chapter 7. Now let's wrap things up tonight. Again, John 7:15, if you're taking notes, what's this all about? This is a challenge to Jesus' right to teach. That's what we've got going on here. Jesus, who gives you the right to come in and teach like this? Now, go later and read. If you haven't finished reading John chapter 7, Jesus is going to make some powerful declarations. If any of you are thirsty, let him come to me. Folks, this reminds us of Isaiah 55, where the Lord God of heaven said, if you're hungry, if you're thirsty, come to me. So Jesus is later going to use the very language that was only associated with God to look at the people there in that temple and say, if you're thirsty, come to me. When we're thirsty, who do we go to? Hope we're not going to a man. Hello? We come directly to him. And Jesus said, out of our what? Like he told the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4, out of your innermost being will flow what? Rivers of living water. So we've got some more great teaching to come. So again, when we come to John chapter 15 or 7 verse 15, really this is a challenge to Jesus' right to teach. Now notice what he says here. Let's wrap it up. Look at verse number 16. Look at what Jesus says. Jesus says, where's my teaching from? In verse 16, it's from the one who sent me. And then look what he says. He declares that whoever walks the path will understand that his teaching is none other than the very revelation from God. In other words, what's Jesus saying? Anyone who genuinely seeks to do the will of God will be able to discern whether his teaching truly is from God.